Part two, social distancing with Dr. Ryan Berg from AEI as we take a trip around Latin America. Dr. Berg, in our first segment, we spent a lot of time focusing on Mexico, a lot of other things happening in Latin America in regards to the pandemic. Are you up for a little trip around the continent?
Let's go on a lightning round.
All right. Wall Street Journal article over the weekend looked at the border closure between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. A little background here. I've got a few years on you. In the 90s, when I was in college, I was getting a certificate in Latin American studies, and that was a look back at the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. If you told me that in the year 2020, I'd be talking to a guy from AEI about the Sandinista government, I would have said you're nuts. But here we are. So let me ask you this. Daniel Ortega, dead or alive?
Oh, he's most certainly alive.
Okay.
He disappeared for about 34 days, which was the longest he's ever disappeared for. By the way, a pattern that's repeated itself time and again. He uses people's underestimation of him and his health clearly to his advantage. But in my opinion, the response of the Nicaraguan government to the pandemic has been absolutely abysmal and quite criminal, to be honest. There have been such things as mandatory political rallies called Love in the time of COVID, which were mass gatherings on the beaches where who knows how many people contracted the virus. And so this has been an absolutely grotesque response. And if I can put in a shameless personal plug here, for all our listeners, I have a report coming out on Nicaragua and the human rights abuses and situation there in a matter of weeks. So there's my plug for the report.
Well, we will definitely be on the lookout for that. Ortega's grip on power somewhat tenuous over the last year. How do you think he ends up on the other side of this thing?
On the contrary, I think that Nicaragua is quite a police state at this point. I see it in many senses as a sort of mini Venezuela in terms of the similarity of its ramp up in human rights abuses, the fact that paramilitary groups are operating side by side police and army units, the fact that the opposition has been effectively leveled not only by the pandemic but also by repression, brutal repression. And the fact that people have been forcibly driven from the country, essentially, most of them to places like Costa Rica, but also folks coming to the southwest border of the United States. UNHCR says about 120,000 so far, but that number could be far higher, and it could grow far higher if the regime's response to the pandemic continues as is, because people will realize there's no help coming, there's no recognition that this is a serious issue, and our hospitals and clinics are overrun. I need to leave.
Do you think the pandemic exacerbates asylum claims at the U.S.-Mexico border?
I think it could eventually. Right now, I don't think we've seen much migration of any at all, because people have by and large been staying in place. But as things begin to lift, I think we could see some migratory movements, yes. Especially if the IMF's prediction of a deep recession in Latin America is true and a slow recovery, you could see migration not only for the pandemic reasons, but also for economic opportunity reasons.
Costa Rica's got a noisy neighbor on its hands. Let's go a little further south through Panama, through the Darien Gap. We're in Colombia now. Talk about another country with a noisy neighbor. By all reports, Colombia is doing a serviceable job of controlling the spread of the virus, but what do you do about a next door neighbor that is really devolving into a real mess?
Colombia is in a really tough spot. I think that it needs to muster support from the entire international community, and particularly from the region, to be able to do its part and provide for what we believe are now 1.8 million migrants of Venezuelan origin in Colombia. Over 5 million overall, but 1.8 million have settled in Colombia somewhere, most in border regions, but some have moved on as far as Bogota and even further. And so they're in a really tough spot because, of course, they're trying to provide for their own people as well. There are going to be a lack of economic, lack of jobs, both in the formal and informal sector. There's already rising levels of xenophobia. Colombia has really been remarkable for a very open approach to Venezuelan migrants thus far. But I've seen a recent poll by Gallup in Colombia, which said that about 87% of Colombians of the sample that they took would like to keep the border closed with Venezuela if it meant fewer migrants, even after the pandemic. And so the patience, I think, there is really running out. And so from the humanitarian perspective, this is a really underfunded crisis. And there was just a meeting today in Brussels. EU donors got together. Much of what was pledged was verbal solidarity, but in terms of money, not much coming.
So what do you think this means for the Venezuelan regime then? You talked about the police state that we see in Nicaragua regime tightening its grip. Something similar in Venezuela, or perhaps a different outcome there?
Well, I think we've seen that already. We've seen the regime tighten its grip with its stay-at-home order at the end of March, I believe it was. It also simultaneously launched an operation called Knock Knock, where basically it was going door to door and arresting or rounding up members of the opposition and intimidating people who were protesting or who have reported to have been protesting. So the repression was going simultaneous to the stay-at-home order. I think that what we've seen in recent days is a further tightening, especially after this really botched invasion. I don't even want to call it an invasion, a small maritime incursion by a number of individuals who clearly were not, acting on behalf of the United States government, but who nevertheless had some connections with both Colombia and with the Venezuelan opposition. Again, that's given the regime another chance or another rhetorical reason to clamp down. And so just this morning, the the Venezuelan Attorney General was investigating the leader of the opposition and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, as being part of a terrorist movement because he was connected with this botched maritime incursion. And so things are definitely tightening in Venezuela, and unfortunately some of the geopolitical happenings have given them reason to do so.
All right, we've worked our way down the Atlantic coast. We're in Brazil now. Brazil is now on the travel ban list. Bolsonaro facing a lot of criticism for his handling of the pandemic. You just want to give us your 30,000-foot view of what's going on there, especially in light of the travel ban?
Sure. Brazil has one of the highest caseloads in the world. Recently, it overtook the UK as being, I think, number 3 in the world. I think since then it's crept up close to number 2, if I'm not mistaken. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of cases, confirmed cases in Brazil. We know that testing isn't enough there, and so actual caseload might be as high as the United States, according to a study by the University of Sao Paulo, I believe it was, a couple weeks ago. And so Brazil is in a whole world of trouble. The president has gone through 2 health ministers in the last month and a half. The job is still vacant. It's being held by an acting person. And so this is one of the biggest job openings in the world. If you're really looking for a challenge, apply to be Jair Bolsonaro's health minister. Right. But it's a very difficult situation there because Brazil's a big country. It's a federative republic, just like the United States, and so you've had a very state-by-state approach in Brazil as well. And so it's difficult to make blanket generalizations about a country of 210 million people when the response has largely been a state-by-state one. For example, in the south of the country, they've been under stay-at-home orders for 6 weeks now, or maybe even 7-8 weeks. So that was pretty much in parallel with the United States. Up in the northeast of the country, which is a poor part of the country, suffers from far more issues of crime and economic informality. They've just started doing stay-at-home orders about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. So you have this massive disparity in terms of the response time as well throughout the entire country.
I was listening to you on one of your AEI podcasts, and you were talking about the fact of certain fairly large cities, they're really challenged by their isolation. Look, you could go to Montana in the United States and you have very few cases, but if you're in a place like Manaus, that isolation really cuts against you. Could you talk a little bit about that, this issue of isolation and public health?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate you bringing up the case of Manaus, which has, for whatever reason, been one of the hardest hit cities in the entire region, and especially in Brazil. There were a number of reports by the Financial Times of London, by the Wall Street Journal, reporting on mass graves being dug around hospitals in Manaus because they couldn't deal with the piles of bodies. Manaus is a city in the middle of Amazonas state. It's only accessible, really accessible by airplane, and so it's very far away from any other city that could be a part of its supply chain. And as a result, it's suffered from, of course, a lack of PPE, and also other food insecurity issues. And medicine insecurity issues. And so for whatever reason, Manaus has really been hit hard, and the mayor of the city has been pleading for help with Brasilia, and unfortunately has been met with hardly anything so far. And so Manaus continues to be one of the hardest hit and really isolated cities in Brazil without much help coming its way.
Yeah. All right, from the sacred to the profane, Dr. Berg, I've got a coworker, and she is planning in the fall to take a fly fishing trip to Argentina. This is your question. You're asked to handicap the question, the chances that she'll be able to make a trip to Argentina in the fall. What do you think?
The fall is a very loose term. When do we have a month that we can place on?
I think it's in November, but I'll double check. I think it's November.
Okay, so she wants to go just at the start of the Southern Hemisphere's summertime.
That's right.
Look, Argentina's response was quick. It was a pretty much countrywide stay-at-home order. It was strictly enforced, especially in highly dense areas like Buenos Aires. There won't be any flights in or out of Argentina if nothing has changed since I've last seen until September. They really canceled a lot of flights in and out of the country. But it's quite possible that in November things could open up again. So I would say maybe a 50, 55, 60% chance that she might be able to go on her
She'll take it. She'll take it.
I imagine she would, yeah.
Dr. Berg, we want to thank you for taking this trip around Latin America with us over these past two segments. As you and I discussed over email, the Arizona Chamber is very invested in our relationship across borders, especially with Mexico, as we anticipate the enforcement of USMCA. So to get someone with your insight into what's going on, not only from a public health standpoint, but also from a supply chain standpoint, we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you guys so much, and thank you to your listeners. Happy to come back anytime you should see fit, and stay safe.
Thanks, Dr. Berg.